Okay, so the last thing we need to do for chapter 3 in the text is introduce a few more logical concepts that are used specifically for formal logic. When you're studying logic, when you're studying critical thinking, it's enough to just talk about the terms we use to evaluate arguments. But there are more ideas that come up in formal logic. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of a truth value. Truth value is simply a statement's relationship to truth. And the easiest way to think about it is just to think that a truth value is something like the words true or false. So true and false are the two basic truth values. But if you think about the way statements work, there are actually more things that you can say besides true and false. You could say that something is kinda true or mostly true. Sometimes you get into really odd abstract evaluations, like saying the statement is neither true nor false. But we're not going to worry about those because in our system, logic is bivalent. That means that the logic only has two truth values, true and false. So once we can talk about truth values, we can begin to talk about other logical properties. And so that's what's going to be going on now. We already talked about how an argument can be valid or invalid. And now we want to do things for other groups of statements. So any individual statement we're going to say can be a tautology, a contingent statement, or a contradiction. Pairs of statements are going to be logically equivalent, contradictory, or neither, and sets of statements are going to be consistent or inconsistent. Let's just run through these. That was a lot of new terminology. I'm going to run through these one at a time and you'll get a handle on them. So the first idea is the idea of a contradiction. A contradiction is a statement that cannot possibly be true because of its basic logic. So if I say that he was both running and standing still at the same time, I've stated a contradiction. You can't both run and stand still at the same time. If I say the colorless object was bright green, that's a contradiction. If I say the circle had sharp corners, that's a contradiction. These are statements that simply cannot be true because of their logic. The contrast, the polar opposite of a contradiction is a tautology. A tautology is a statement that must be true because of its basic logic. So the gold standard for tautologies are all bachelors are unmarried men. Right? A bachelor is simply defined as an unmarried man. So that statement absolutely has to be true. An invisible object can't be seen. All triangles have three sides. So in between the realm of contradictions and tautologies, there are all the contingent statements. So these are statements that could be either true or false, depending upon the way the world is apart from the sentence, right? So if I say it is raining right now, I can't figure out whether or not that sentence is true just by looking at its logic. I need to go out and I need to look out the window. I am a bachelor is different than all bachelors are unmarried. I'm a bachelor is something that you have to confirm by talking to me. This triangle is green. These are all contingent statements. So those are things we do with single statements. When we talk about pairs of statements, we say that they are logically equivalent if they must always have the same truth value because of their basic logic. So, it is raining and there is water falling from the sky are logically equivalent. If one is true, the other is true. If one is false, the other is false. Bob is a bachelor. Bob is an unmarried man. If one is true, the other is true. Peter Parker loves Mary Jane Watson. Spider-Man loves Mary Jane Watson. These are equivalent because Peter Parker is Spider-Man, at least in most versions of the story. Essentially, logically equivalent statements say the same thing. We said that a pair of statements was logically equivalent if it always had the same truth value. The polar opposite of that are contradictory statements. These are statements that must have opposite truth values because of their logic. Imagine that two people are sitting next to each other, and then they're in the same row of chairs, and they're not in the same chair. Panos and Sylvia. Panos is to the right of Sylvia. Sylvia is to the right of Panos. Those statements are contradictory because if one's true, the other has to be false, and vice versa. Consistent statements. A set of statements is consistent if it is possible for them all to be true. So now we not just have pairs of statements, but 3 or more statements, right? So these statements are consistent. This shape is a triangle. This shape is red. And if something is red, then it must have 3 sides. On the other hand, if I say if something is red, then it must have 4 sides, now the statements are inconsistent. The 3 of them cannot all be true at the same time. So that gives us this full set of terms. Sentences can be tautologies, contingent sentences, or contradictions, depending upon whether they are always true, sometimes true and sometimes false, or always false. Pairs of sentences can be logically equivalent if they always have the same truth value, contradictory if they always have opposite truth values, and neither if they're neither. Sets of sentences that can be consistent or inconsistent, and arguments can be valid or invalid. So for the last set of exercises for this week, you need to look at some groups of sentences in ordinary English and say if they have any of these properties.